When I launched Nuyen Coffee Supply in 2018, the first company solely dedicated to importing, roasting, and distributing coffee beans from Vietnam with no prior experience in importing, roasting, or the coffee industry, my friends and family wondered why. Prior to this, I was living in New York City and working as a full-time freelance filmmaker and writer. My main topics of coverage were immigration, racial justice, and creative entrepreneurship. So in essence, I've always cared about increasing representation and visibility of communities that were historically pushed to the margins. And working as a full-time freelancer in New York City, I drank a lot of coffee. And also, as a first-generation Vietnamese American, I made frequent trips to Vietnam to visit my family abroad. And so at a young age, I fell in love with Vietnamese coffee as I had experienced it in Vietnam. Majority Robusta, slow dripping through a Vietnamese Fiend filter. Over the last 5 years in New York City, Vietnamese food and culture was booming with the emergence of new modern restaurants such as Dien Di, Madame Vo, and Saigon Social. Finally, Vietnamese cuisine was hitting the mainstream headlines, even the New York Times. Personally, I was so ecstatic to see my culture represented and celebrated by the masses. And on a similar wavelength, but slightly lower, I noticed that Vietnamese iced coffee was becoming increasingly trendy. The words Vietnamese iced coffee was hitting coffee shops and beverage menus all across the city. And I thought, well, this is so cool. People are finally embracing Vietnamese coffee. Until I tried it, and 9 out of 10 times I was utterly repulsed because what I found was these coffee shops weren't using Vietnamese coffee to make their Vietnamese iced coffee. More often than not, these coffee shops were using their house drip or their house cold brew, which could have been anything from an Ethiopian bean to a Peruvian bean, adding condensed milk to it, and then calling it Vietnamese iced coffee. Now, not only is this cultural appropriation, it's miseducation to the consumers. Because condensed milk doesn't make it Vietnamese. Using Vietnamese coffee beans makes it Vietnamese coffee. And if a business is going to benefit from a culture by using the buzzwords Vietnamese iced coffee, the producers of this culture and the producers of Vietnamese coffee beans should be included in this transaction to benefit from the trend as well. I felt inspired to do something about this problem. So I started to learn as much as I could about Vietnamese coffee. In my research, I was amazed to discover that Vietnam is the second largest producer of coffee in the world. And on top of that, Vietnam is the #1 producer of Robusta beans. I couldn't believe that I'd never heard of this fact before. More into my research, I realized that it was actually pretty difficult for me, the consumer, to find real Vietnamese coffee beans in the United States. At this time, the two main options that Vietnamese restaurants were using for their coffee was either Nguyen, a product of Vietnam, usually pre-ground and also very well known for including artificial ingredients, or the other one was Café du Monde, a New Orleans-based company offering pre-ground coffee, however, not providing any information on its website or packaging about where it sources its beans. So I realized it was actually really hard for me to find fresh roasted Vietnamese coffee beans anywhere in New York City. All of these discoveries, from the appropriation to the miseducation to the lack of access, led me to build and launch Nguyen Coffee Supply. In 2016, when I was traveling to Vietnam to visit my family, I talked to my relatives about this idea to elevate the profile of Vietnamese coffee beans by importing and roasting in Brooklyn. One of my aunts said, I have a friend who used to work in my company, but then left my company to go take over his family coffee farm. We booked a ticket to go visit him in the lot. I met up with him, visited his farms, and the rest is history. The word disruptor has become such a buzzword in the entrepreneurial landscape that when you imagine a disruptor, you often think about a crazy new innovation or a new product that hasn't been done before that has the ability to change the world. But what if I told you that the key to disrupting your industry is not to reinvent the wheel, but to take control of the wheel and increase transparency? This goes for both the creator and the consumer. We all have the power to disrupt any industry we care about by prioritizing transparency. Now, earlier, when I mentioned that I'd never heard of the fact that Vietnam was the second largest producer of coffee in the world, I really wasn't the only one. In a survey conducted by the National Coffee Association, respondents were asked to identify which countries they associate with the production of coffee. 84% of respondents stated that they strongly or somewhat associate Colombia with producing coffee. This was followed by 67% of people associating Brazil with the production of coffee. The lowest number of respondents, at only 16%, said they associate Vietnam with the production of coffee. Perception and reality are at opposite ends of the pole, right? And not only is Vietnam the second largest producer of coffee in the world, the United States is the #1 importer of Vietnamese coffee beans. In 2017, the US imported 170,000 tons of Vietnamese coffee. It begs the question, for such a top-ranking fact, why don't more people know or associate coffee production with Vietnam? Lack of transparency can happen on many levels: in government, in production, in commerce, and in marketing. Yes, it is true that for many years, large corporations would use Vietnamese coffee beans in their cheap products, including instant coffee, supermarket shelf coffee, or private label, right? And while these corporations made billions of dollars in the coffee industry, Vietnamese workers and farmers remained in poverty due to the low price tags attached to their coffee beans. Lack of resources lead to poor working conditions, poor living conditions, sometimes a poor product, and too often misconceptions. There are potential dangers for the end consumer. In Vietnam, the lack of transparency there can lead some companies to add fillers to their ground coffee, such as roasted soybeans. Now, is transparency a class issue? Does increased transparency lead to increased prices for the consumer? Possibly, but not necessarily. Yes, of course, all businesses want to make a profit, or at the very least, have a sustainable business model. But there is a difference between creating a financially thriving business and squeezing every penny for profit possible. And actually, for the entrepreneur, transparency is good for business. 73% of consumers say they are willing to pay for a product that offers complete transparency. 85% of Americans say transparency from business is more important than ever. In addition, for companies with a track record of offering transparency, 9 out of 10 people say they are more likely to give second chances after a bad experience and even stick with the company through crises. And hey, we all make mistakes. Yes, transparency can be scary. Transparency opens up the doors for accountability from all of us. An accountability to produce safe products, an accountability to treat people well, and an accountability to be responsible consumers. But once we push through the fear of accountability and own up to our social responsibility, transparency is an opportunity for us to each empower each other and create a better world for everyone. If you're an entrepreneur and you want to disrupt your industry, create transparency. If you're a consumer and you want to disrupt your industry, demand transparency. Imagine if we all knew where our products were coming from and how they were being produced, we could improve the lives of people across the globe simply by letting companies know we care. Imagine if companies were transparent about their production and the communities they work with, they could build the trust and gain the loyalty of consumers. Imagine if your beloved daily ritual of coffee wasn't just coffee, and it was also associated with coffee production in Vietnam. How would that change the way we appreciate and respect other cultures? When we can break down the walls of information that keep producers in a cycle of poverty, consumers from being empowered, and companies from developing trust, we can create a system of openness, honesty, and sustainability that truly creates a win-win world. Thank you.